Mexican cartels are not just organized crime communities. They are real networks that entangle Mexico in all spheres, from drug trafficking to oil exports. The composition of these networks is not static. There's no stability on Mexico's criminal map. Cartels can unexpectedly unite or predictably clash. The main factor for determining an organization's strength is its proximity to the U.S. border, which is why the Sinaloa Cartel is the oldest and most powerful organization, controlling half of the border with the United States. This cartel has become a true symbol of old-school Mexican drug trafficking. The other half of the border in the northeast of the country and the Gulf Cartel entered the game much later than Sinaloa, but have become an ominous symbol of this century. Having become full-fledged participants in the global drug trade, they changed the rules and, unlike Sinaloa, no longer tried to live in peace with the state and their own compatriots. The Gulf Cartel created the notorious Los Zetas and gave birth to the modern shape of Mexican crime, where every drug lord has his own small army and all problems are solved with violence, which has been going on for a couple of decades now. And if you're interested in hearing why this particular organization turned the tables, then meet the Gulf Cartel on the other side of the law. The beginning of the 20th century was a time of global change. Mexico was also deeply affected. The end of the revolution, which raged in the country's typical violent way, coincided with the adoption of prohibition in the United States. Regional organized crime syndicates in Mexico rushed to American markets to supply the public with the drinks they craved. A flood of now illegal alcohol poured into the U.S. Mexican smugglers had plenty of profit from along the entire border. At the same time, routes were being developed that would be used even a century later. Another surge of activity came with World War I and its constant need for raw materials for the most popular medicine of the time, morphine. The victory of the Mexican Revolution did not bring peace. A long power struggle began, resulting in the emergence of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. In 1946, through populism, corruption, and behind-the-scenes intrigues, such as vote rigging and intimidation, the party would rule the country for the next 54 years. During the PRI's rule, a nationwide system emerged in which local political bosses, known as caciques, or chiefs, ruled the states. But this was not only in the legal sphere. I've talked before about how closely politicians and drug dealers were intertwined in Sinaloa in previous videos. On the Gulf Coast, it was exactly the same. The history of drug trafficking in the state of Tamaulipas began in the 1920s with Virgilio Barrera, a heroin and morphine dealer. Researchers even compare him to Al Capone, such as Barrera's power in these border areas. In 1929, Barrera was arrested and police documents referred to him not only as a smuggler, but also as a major drug trafficker from Nuevo Laredo. Around the same time that Barrera was captured, opium poppies and marijuana began to be cultivated in the region. Production never reached the levels of the best states in this regard, such as Sinaloa or Sonora, but it could compete with the Michoacán and Guerrero. Plus, later, when a major U.S. military operation against drug producers called Condor was carried out against the plantations of the so-called Golden Triangle, consisting of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, the Gulf was left unaffected. By 1975, there were reports of 2 tons of marijuana being seized simultaneously in the remote area of Berlanga. Such news would appear in the newspapers more and more often, but in addition to reports of seizures, crime reports predictably began to rise. In the same decade, Nuevo Laredo experienced its first major wave of drug-related killings. In 1971, 33 people were killed, including suspected drug traffickers, police officers, and civilians who happened to be at the scene of armed clashes. The following year, the death toll rose to 60. The newspaper at the time called these murders jackal killings and claimed that they began on November 2, 1970, when 2 federal agents, allegedly linked to drug traffickers, were executed in the La Liberia diner. After these tragic events, clearly linked to the division of territory and spheres of influence, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra, who by that time was already an influential smuggler in Tamaulipas, came to power in the region. The man considered to be the founder of the Gulf Cartel lived in Matamoros, from where he controlled not only the flow of drugs, but also the flow of contraband cars, equipment, and much more. Juan Nepomuceno Guerra was born in Tamaulipas in the city of Matamoros in 1915, at the height of the revolution. His father was a simple, poor farmer and, like everyone else in the area, resorted to smuggling to survive. By his teen years, Nepomuceno Guerra was already fully involved in smuggling operations between the US and Mexico. This was never considered shameful. On the contrary, the roots of modern drug culture and the romanticization of crime go back to those distant times when desperate smugglers transported everything north, from whiskey to the bones of Mayan chiefs. Moreover, Matamoros had a rich criminal history even before the smuggling era of the 20th century. It was founded by pirates at the north of the Rio Grande in the 18th century. Everything was available there: gold, wine, spices, opium, and slaves. Starting with whiskey, Guerra gradually expanded his business to include many other goods. The fact is that Mexico at the time lived under a closed border economic model that prohibited the import of almost all types of goods. Therefore, the sale of household appliances, all kinds of electronics, foreign wines, and other alcoholic beverages was a very profitable business in Mexico until the country opened up to world trade. In the following decades, gambling, prostitution, and car theft were added to his business activities. His motto was, "If it can get across the border bridge, I'll deliver it." By the time the PRI was consolidating its control over Mexico, Nepomuceno Guerra was consolidating his control over Tamaulipas. By the early 1970s, he was a respected businessman. He ran a nightclub, a restaurant, and a cafe, and was a well-known figure in Matamoros. The Netflix series Narcos Mexico portrayed him quite accurately, a seemingly good-natured old man who was greeted by all the local children, but there wasn't enough time to reveal what this sweet grandpa with candy in his pockets was really up to. He was described as a very harsh and arrogant man, willing to do anything for business. In the early 1960s, the son of legendary Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa, Colonel Octavio Villacas, was shot dead in Matamoros shortly after confiscating a shipment of contraband coffee and allegedly refusing to return it even for a hefty bribe. Nepomuceno Guerra's bodyguard and driver confessed to the crime, claiming that Villacas had allegedly planned to kill their boss. It is well known that in the 1950s, Nepomuceno Guerra personally killed his first wife in a fit of jealousy over a famous actor. His second wife bore him 3 sons, and it was rumored that God was punishing him for all his deeds. The first son was born with Down syndrome, the second was openly gay, and the youngest became a Satanist and murderer who, according to rumors, dismembered gringos on his ranch and ate them. That is why Nepomuceno Guerra's favorite nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego, would be next to come to power. Over a 50-year period from 1930 to 1980, Guerra earned $5 billion, according to official reports released in 1987. These also stated that he owned over 7,400 acres of land in Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. Nevertheless, in the documents of the Drug Enforcement Administration, he was always considered more of a major smuggler than a drug lord. However, smuggling goods and drug trafficking are not mutually exclusive concepts. At the height of Nepomuceno Guerra's fame, heroin and marijuana trafficking was not the main business in Tamaulipas. They were technically unable to supply the same volumes as the Sinaloans. But over time, by the early 70s, drug trafficking had replaced all other types of smuggling, thanks to Americans who demanded more and more Mexican weed and then more Colombian cocaine. So why didn't Guerra, when the time came to recognize the business, get heavily involved in the drug trafficking? And why did the Gulf Cartel only appear on the map in 1989? Why didn't the successful Sinaloa drug lords join forces with him or drive him out of the market to take advantage of Nepomuceno Guerra's political connections and border crossings? Believe it or not, the answer lies in government protection. In building his empire, Guerra established what was perhaps the most complex network of relationships with politicians and officials at all levels of government and on both sides of the border. Behind the modern history of Tamaulipas lies a complex history of political and business elites who have encouraged criminal business practices for decades. Researchers call this region a time capsule where the absence of state authority has contributed to the monopolization of resources. Carlos Reza Nostares, a consultant with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, argued that Mexican criminal communities cannot be classified as typical models of organized crime, with their links to political power, but rather as a concept of state-organized crime. In other words, those responsible for maintaining law and order are not simply involved in criminal activity or turning a blind eye to it, but are fully participating in it, using various illegal levers to achieve their goals as representatives of the state. To put it simply, there is no civil society. It was Juan Nepomuceno who started the trend of mixing drug lords with the elite and created an extensive network of political contacts in northeastern Mexico that was unparalleled in the country, while the people of Sinaloa were fighting amongst themselves. And with the Americans, everything was going smoothly in Tamaulipas. Nepomuceno maintained close friendships with influential union leaders in the region, and with former governors of Tamaulipas. This network included not only local politicians, but also influential leaders at the national level, such as union leader Joaquin Hernandez Garcia and Raul Salinas Lozano, former Secretary of Agriculture and father of future President Carlos Salinas de Gortari. In addition to controlling illegal border crossings, Juan Nepomuceno provided political support to the Institutional Revolutionary Party through the Confederation of Mexican Workers, which periodically received significant donations from him. His nephew Jesus Roberto Huerta became mayor of Matamoros from 1984 to 1987. By the mid-80s, when the Tamaulipas border became a strategic drug corridor that facilitated the delivery of drugs to the east coast of the United States, the previously slow expansion of the Gulf Cartel accelerated sharply. There were several reasons for this. The first reason was the same as all the other organizations. Thanks to the U.S.'s success in the fight against drugs in the Caribbean in the late 80s, Mexico became a major transshipment point for coke and heroin and remained a major producer of marijuana. The routes that had been laid down by Guerra over the course of 50 years were now highly sought after by traffickers. And while constant raids in Sinaloa slowed down and complicated operations, there were no such problems in the Northeast. This was the second reason for the growth. It was a godforsaken land where not just cartels in the usual sense had been growing for decades, but true state-organized crime. Unlike in Sinaloa, where deputies were indirectly involved in drug trafficking but still distanced themselves from traffickers, in Tamaulipas, the government officials themselves were members of cartels. In other words, they did not just take money from drug lords and turn a blind eye to their activities. They were co-founders and full participants. The third reason was the emergence of Colombian players. At the time, Colombian drug traffickers began to form important alliances with their Mexican counterparts in response to the growing demand for illegal substances. Juan Garcia Abrego, nephew and successor to Juan Nepomuceno negotiated with the Rodriguez-Orejuela brothers of the North Cali Cartel in the early 1980s. This deal marked the beginning of the Cartel del Golfo, which would soon become a full-fledged participant in Mexican as well as global drug trafficking. Abrego agreed to transport drugs from the southern border of Mexico to Texas, in exchange for half of each shipment. It was a very risky deal for him, but the profits promised to be fabulous. The expansion of the business required more extensive logistical coordination, the purchase of aircraft and other complex equipment, the construction of airstrips, secret warehouses, and the bribery of law enforcement agencies along the southern border, in northeastern Mexico, and along the Gulf of Mexico region. Thus, it was Juan Garcia Abrego who contributed to the prosperity of his uncle's business by organizing large-scale drug trafficking. He was born in 1944 in Texas and, of course, was involved in the business from an early age. It should be noted that not all of his family members were so deeply involved in the trade. For example, Garcia Abrego's older brother was a respectable American businessman with a college education. Under the guidance of his uncle, who immediately noticed the smart young man, Juan Garcia Abrego began to learn the ropes. According to some sources, he first learned to steal cars, and only then, in the early 1970s, did he fully enter the marijuana trade. Gradually, Abrego became an increasingly prominent figure in his uncle's criminal organization in Matamoros, just as Colombian drug traffickers were looking for new routes to the USA. Garcia Abrego himself, a product of Mexican crime, never sought to resolve conflicts peacefully, despite his absurdly cheerful nickname, El Muñeco, the doll. In 1984, he ordered the elimination of a major boss of one of the local gangs, nicknamed El Cacho. The first attempt to eliminate El Cacho was unsuccessful. He was seriously wounded but managed to escape. Enraged, Abrego later sent 10 of his best fighters to the riot clinic in Matamoros, where El Cacho was being treated. They fired on the ward, killing 5 people, including a doctor. El Cacho survived this attack as well, but soon died of his wounds in a hospital in Monterrey. The incident with El Cacho was widely covered in the press, caused a great public outcry, and can be called, in a way, the first warning sign of Los Zetas, because local criminals before Garcia Abrego and El Cacho were not known for resorting to unmotivated serial violence, which can attract too much attention. But it was not only through violence that Garcia Abrego achieved success in the organization. He actively expanded and strengthened what his uncle had built up. His corruption network includes figures familiar to you from our video about the Guadalajara cartel, such as Guillermo Gonzalez Calderoni, one of the top commanders of the federal police in the 1980s, and a man worth $400 million. It was reported that government prosecutor Octavio Porte Petit and Miguel Aldana Ibarra, director of the Mexican branch of Interpol, were also on the Gulf Cartel's payroll. Garcia Abrego's cousin, Francisco Perez, later spoke about the transfer of $500,000 to Javier Soelo Trejo, Mexico's deputy attorney general from 1988 to 1990. Abrego also quote-unquote participated in the 1988 presidential elections in Mexico, when the PRI clearly rigged the vote. This event is well shown in Narcos Mexico. Then President Salinas came to power, which was good for everyone involved in drugs. However, the US government chose to turn a blind eye to these facts, as Salinas demonstrated clear loyalty and warm relations with the United States. The Salinas family, in turn, had long-standing and warm relations with the criminals of Matamoros. When the PRI chose its new leader, Matamoros' reputation as a fun, safe place for Americans to party and relax collapsed. In March 1989, a student at the University of Texas in Austin named Mark J. Kilroy disappeared near the bridge connecting Brownsville and Matamoros. A month later, officials discovered Kilroy's body along with those of 11 other murder victims at a ranch in rural Tamaulipas after finding a blood-stained altar with clothes and photographs of small children in Matamoros. Kilroy was kidnapped and sacrificed by a drug gang that had turned into a cult led by Adolfo Jesus Constanzo. The gang killed Kilroy and the others for protection, one of its members said. Constanzo was assisted by Matamoros native and former Texas College honor student Sarah Maria Audret Villarreal, whom the organization called the Witch, as well as Juan Nepomuceno Guerra's youngest son. The police later concluded that the cult members had killed about 40 people. This was another dark stain on the reputation of northeastern Mexico, depriving the area of wealthy tourists. But all this, the cults and the gang fights, was only the beginning. By 1989, Juan Garcia Abrego's criminal enterprise was transporting about 40 tons of cocaine to the U.S. annually. He acquired large ranches south of Matamoros where planes from Colombia loaded with cocaine could land, and from where the dope could be smuggled across the border from Matamoros to Brownsville. From there, it was sent on to Houston, and then to distribution centers in Los Angeles and New York. Meanwhile, south of the border, the Gulf Cartel's territory stretched from the Tamaulipas border cities of Matamoros, Reynosa, and Nuevo Laredo in the north to the state capital of Ciudad Victoria and the port of Tampico in the south. However, despite his boldness, Juan Garcia Abrego was not alone in his ambitions. The Sinaloans were ahead of the rest of the world, but with the arrest of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the organization split into factions in Sinaloa, Tijuana, and Ciudad Juarez, which formed their own criminal enterprises. In Tijuana, there were the Arellano Felix brothers and their Tijuana Cartel. The faction based in Sinaloa would become known as the Sinaloa Cartel and would be led by El Chapo and Hector Luis El Güero Palma Salazar, while Amado Carrillo Fuentes would become the head of the Juarez Cartel. A fierce feud broke out between Tijuana and Sinaloa, undoubtedly playing into the hands of Garcia Abrego, who had remained on the sidelines of the territorial division thanks to the protection of high-ranking officials. Tamaulipas was not part of the Sinaloa organization, acting independently and without regard to what was happening on the northwestern border. But despite this, things were still unsettled in Matamoros. It became clear to DEA representatives that a powerful drug trafficking organization, unknown until the late 80s, had formed in the Northeast. It's from this time that the history of the Gulf Cartel is considered to have begun. In May 1991, it became known that the Gulf Cartel was plotting to assassinate Colombian drug trafficker Oliverio Chavez Araujo, which led to an outbreak of violence in the Ceferezo prison in Matamoros. 18 people were killed, and the prison was under siege by the police for 2 weeks. rumors circulated that this was the initiative of one of Abrego's lieutenants, Tomas Gringo Sanchez Gonzalez, and he paid for this initiative with his life. After this incident, the Americans took note of Abrego because in addition to the prison siege, his name came up in connection with a major drug bust. During an FBI raid on a farm linked to the Gulf Cartel in Harlingen, Texas, near Brownsville, cocaine worth more than $100 million was discovered. At the time, it was the second largest drug seizure in U.S. history. Garcia Abrego was also the subject of a secret grand jury indictment in Dallas in February 1990, which charged him and his cousin Francisco Perez with drug trafficking. Despite being under the nose of federal officials, Garcia Abrego nevertheless spent most of 1990 in McAllen, Texas, and in a rented house in the suburbs of Chicago, taking a break from running his Mexican drug empire. Although the Matamoros crime organization was now indisputably in the hands of Garcia Abrego, he had moved his operational base to Monterrey in 1989. Over the next 5 years, he changed his location in the city every few weeks, and sometimes every few days. Around the same time, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra was unexpectedly charged with tax evasion. However, due to his health, he was never imprisoned, and the case was brought to court merely for show and for the Americans, as it was led by none other than the cartel's best friend, González Calderoni. By 1993, Garcia Abrego had firmly established himself as a crime boss in the eyes of the U.S. government. He was the subject of an open indictment in Houston for drug trafficking, money laundering, bribing an undercover FBI agent, and ordering acts of violence, including the murder of numerous individuals. But the drug game was far from the only game in northern Mexico. Political games also influenced subsequent events, and these cannot be overlooked. In December 1992, after years of negotiations, Presidents Salinas and George H.W. Bush, along with the Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, gathered in San Antonio, Texas, to sign the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. 1 year later, the U.S. Congress ratified this historic treaty, which radically changed the economic map of the region. NAFTA opened the door for jobs to move from the U.S. to Mexico, which came as a shock to many American companies. U.S. corporate investment in Mexican manufacturing capacity rose from $1 billion to $2.5 billion in just 1 year after the agreement was signed. The United States reduced tariffs on Mexican industrial goods, especially textiles and clothing, while Mexico, in turn, made its agricultural and industrial goods more affordable for Americans. The Mexican maquiladoras, low-cost manufacturing plants, flourished. At first glance, Mexico seemed to be on the verge of a bright future. Crime problems on the border had always existed, but they did not seem insurmountable. But in early 1994, Mexico's southern states were rocked by an uprising of the Zapatistas, a radical leftist group that opposed NAFTA, believing that the agreement only exacerbated inequality. The uprising was quickly suppressed with the help of a new military counterterrorism unit, GAIF, created in 1986 and trained in the U.S. A couple of years later, some of the fighters from this elite unit would become part of the Gulf Cartel, known as Los Zetas. This event was a harbinger of the future turmoil that awaited Mexico and the entire region. After the Zapatista uprising, PRI presidential candidate Luis Donaldo Colosio was shot dead in Tijuana, allegedly by a lone gunman, which raised doubts. Journalist Eduardo Valle claimed that the Gulf Cartel was behind the assassination, having infiltrated the PRI and the government, making justice impossible. 6 months after Colosio's assassination, José Francisco Ruiz Mosiu, former secretary of the PRI and former son-in-law of Carlos Salinas, was shot dead. He had spoken openly in the press about state fraud and abuses by the PRI. His killer, Daniel Aguilar Trevino, a native of Tamaulipas, claimed that the murder was linked to Colosio's assassination, the order for which had been signed at Salinas' residence. Aguilar also claimed that government agents had kidnapped his family. At the same time, PRI Congressman Manuel Muñoz Roca, who wrote a letter to the prosecutor's office about the president's involvement, disappeared, and his remains, found on a ranch in Matamoros, were never officially identified, due to alleged poor preservation, although members of his family confirmed at the identification that it was him. After Colosio's death, Ernesto Zedillo, former Minister of Education and Colosio's campaign manager, won the election. A few months later, the older brother of former President Carlos Salinas, Raul Salinas de Gortari, was convicted of organizing the assassination of Ruiz Maciú. However, the conviction was later overturned. After declaring a strange hunger strike in protest against his brother's arrest, Salinas fled abroad, where he lived for several years before returning to continue business in his homeland. Incidentally, regarding one of the episodes in Narcos Mexico, where two boys kill a maid, these boys were the Salinas brothers, and such an episode did indeed take place in 1951, when 8-year-old Raul and 3-year-old Carlos accidentally killed their 12-year-old maid Manuela while playing. The murder was ruled accidental, and the brothers' parents were reprimanded for leaving a loaded weapon in the house. I would like to remind you that the Salinas brothers' father was a close friend and associate of Juan Nepomuceno Guerra. The murder of Ruiz Maciú also drew unwanted attention to the criminal monarchy ruling Tamaulipas. The FBI included Garcia Abrego on the list of the 10 most wanted fugitives, the first Mexican drug lord to be included, and offered a reward of $2 million for information leading to his capture. Just 10 months later, on the night of January 4, 1996, Garcia Abrego was arrested at a ranch in Nuevo León by federal police officers who he had once lavished with huge sums of money. The next day, Juan Garcia Abrego, the once powerful lord of Tamaulipas, was extradited to the USA, stuffed into a plane like a cat in a bag, wrote journalist Yolanda Figueroa. According to the most conservative estimates, at the time of Garcia Abrego's arrest, the Gulf Cartel's annual income from drug trafficking was around $20 billion. Coincidentally, this was the exact amount that the United States had lent Mexico to overcome its 1995 financial crisis. The incredible rise of the Gulf Cartel was not only the result of Garcia Abrego's vision or leadership skills. The complicity of key politicians and the involvement of police at all levels in drug trade operations were crucial and allowed the Gulf Cartel's drug lord to control about 30% of land cocaine shipments to the United States by the mid-1990s. According to some estimates, the cartel spent around $500 million a year on bribes to all levels of the Mexican government. The Gulf also gained almost complete control over the media in alliance with the Tamaulipas government. In short, local authorities and other key public and political figures worked very closely with this drug trafficking group. In the coming years, the Gulf Cartel would cease to be a regional criminal organization operating as a subsidiary of Colombian drug cartels and become a key player in the transnational drug trade. However, as I mentioned earlier, the Gulf Cartel as a drug organization only emerged after the collapse of the Sinaloa Cartel in 1989. At that time, due to the arrest of leaders in connection with the Kiki Camarena case, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and Calderoni divided all of Mexico into plazas, but none of the Sinaloans took control of northeastern Mexico, with its lucrative transit routes. This territory was simply not taken into account in the division. Researcher Valdez Castellanos claims that the Sinaloans were simply not allowed to do so, from the highest level of government. If the distribution had been carried out exclusively with the participation of the Sinaloan bosses, i.e., without the government authorities, then the Tamaulipas territories would have been included. Or, at least at the height of their alliance, they would certainly have tried to challenge control, since Nepomuceno Guerra was an ailing old man and Garcia Abrego had not yet become leader. As Gallardo himself claimed, it was Guillermo González Calderoni who did not allow it. Since we know the outcome, the Gulf Cartel operated independently under the leadership of Juan Garcia Abrego, without the Sinaloans' participation. Félix Gallardo's version gains merit. Thus, the decision to divide the drug traffickers was initiated from above, by those who were supposed to fight trafficking. But in the model of state-organized crime, the picture looks more logical. This does not mean that all representatives of the authorities were involved. It only means that in Mexico there were real state groups with a certain degree of autonomy and the ability to make decisions that contradicted the general policy of the government. Representatives of the state who were interested in ensuring that the Sinaloans did not interfere in their affairs were involved in the formation of the Gulf Cartel. The Gulf Cartel was not subsequently led by a family clan, which is a clear distinction from other Mexican drug organizations. The existence of family ties between the leaders of a criminal enterprise is important because it guarantees trust and loyalty, which are essential for its proper functioning. This was the case in Sinaloa, where everyone was related in some way: brothers, cousins, brothers, and father-in-law and uncles. Yes, they also fought each other, but not as fiercely as the contenders for the throne in the Gulf Cartel would in the near future. Juan Garcia Abrego was put in place as leader by Guillermo González Calderoni. which was the piece needed to complete the division of the drug trade involving police factions on the country's new criminal map. It is curious that Abrego's leadership would last little longer than the 6-year presidency of Carlos Salinas de Gortari. After the arrest and extradition of Garcia Abrego, his brother Humberto would have been the natural successor, but he had been in prison since 1994 on money laundering charges. Although he managed to get out of prison in '97 due to lack of evidence, he preferred to leave the drug trade to enjoy his considerable profits. No one heard from him again. Since there was no family left to inherit the business, Garcia Abrego preferred that Oscar Malherbe, one of his high-ranking lieutenants, remain in power in mid-1996. And this was the case for some time until he was arrested during a visit to Mexico City in February 1997. The large and profitable organization was once again left without a leader. And since there was no family succession in the Gulf Cartel, its future came to depend on the ambitions and abilities of the contenders to bribe, deceive, and kill. This is what the three contenders for leadership did throughout 1997 and most of '98. These men were Baldomero Medina, aka the Lord of the Trailers, who was a specialist in transporting cocaine in trailers, as well as Salvador Chava Gomez and Osiel Cardenas. Chava planned to kill Baldomero, but the plan did not work as expected, and the Lord of the Trailers was only seriously injured, but that was enough for him to withdraw his candidacy for leader of the Gulf Cartel. Chava and Osiel decided to go into business together, which meant they first had to kill federal judicial police officer Antonio Davila, who also wanted to run the drug enterprise and planned to eliminate them. Joint leadership worked until Osiel became convinced that two bosses were too many. While he was reorganizing the operational side of the business, restoring contacts with cocaine suppliers, determining routes and buying protection, organizing cross-border transfers, etc. Chava brought order to the groups that were working independently, gathering everyone under the Gulf banner. When this was accomplished, he considered himself the boss and began to live in luxury, giving orders to Cardenas. Cardenas quickly grew tired of this and sent his old friend to the afterlife in the summer of 1999. The murder of his partner earned Cardenas the nickname Killer of Friends, which would accompany him for the rest of his life. While Chava was pacifying the gangs, Osiel Cardenas was working for the future. To understand the organizational structure of the Gulf Cartel in 1996, two key facts must be taken into account. First, the Gulf was not the sole owner of the entire plaza at the time, but worked with 4 border crossings: Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, Miguel Aleman, and Matamoros, so territorial control was much more complicated than in Tijuana or Juarez, where everything was concentrated in one place. Any of the crossings at that time could be attacked by one of the numerous Tamaulipas gangs. Second, a significant portion of cocaine was transported from Colombia via Guatemala by land. The rest arrived by sea to the Gulf Coast ports of Campeche, Veracruz, or Tampico Altamira, which meant securing a transport and security network that crossed the entire country, from Chiapas and Campeche in the south to Tamaulipas in the north, passing through Tabasco and Veracruz. Later, they opened the Pacifico-Tamaulipas route, which began in Guerrero and Michoacán in the southwest, crossed the Bajío, continued through San Luis Potosí and Zacatecas to Torreón, then to Saltillo Monterrey, and from there to any of the borders in Tamaulipas. The route ran along the railways. These two factors make it clear why the Gulf was a much larger organization in terms of operational personnel of all kinds: drivers, mechanics, communications operators, toll collectors, accountants, and donkey drivers who transported drugs to the other side. And in terms of its security structure, informants, hitmen, hitman trainers, arms dealers, etc., and therefore significantly more expensive. It was also more aggressive. The organization had to protect its routes from other cartels and smaller organizations that wanted to grow bigger. Thus, the organization founded by Garcia Abrego under the cover of the Federal Judicial Police expanded significantly under the leadership of Osiel Cardenas. As soon as he took control, he formed a close-knit team of employees and distributed positions and responsibilities among them. Matamoros for Eduardo El Cos Costilla Sanchez, Gilberto El Jun Garcia was assigned to Miguel Aleman, Gregorio El Goyo Sauceda Gamboa to Reynosa, Dia Ordaz went to Efrain Torres, also known as Z15. Osiel's brother, Antonio aka Tony Tormentas, was also part of the leadership cell. The growth of the organization was also facilitated by the fact that after the capture of Garcia Abrego and Oscar Malherbe, the authorities considered the Gulf Cartel to be fragmented and unable to recover. Although Osiel Cardenas had a criminal record and was known to the authorities, they did not think he could become a leader. Cardenas himself regularly paid journalists to write about him exclusively as a petty car thief. Osiel had always been an authoritarian, cruel, and paranoid leader, and he also suffered from cocaine addiction. This was what prompted him to organize his own security detail and counterintelligence service so he could sleep peacefully. That's how Los Zetas came into being. And that was a turning point in the history of the Mexican drug trade. Los Zetas emerged, of course, not only because of Osiel's paranoia, but also because of the general situation in Tamaulipas. From the fall of Garcia Abrego in January 1996 to mid-1999, the state was literally swarming with drug traffickers of all stripes and calibers, eager to grab their piece of the pie. Their rivals were not sleeping. While the Gulf was in limbo, at least 2 new organizations formed in Tamaulipas. La Familia Michoacana, founded by Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, aka El Mas Loco, the most crazy one, and the Cartel de los Valencia, founded in the 1990s by Armando Valencia Cornelio and his cousins after they split up from El Chapo's faction and the Sinaloans. In addition, every major trafficker sought to create his own combat unit to protect his business interests. Eduardo El Cos Costilla, the head of Matamoros, hired 2 gangs, Los Zetas and Los Tangos, as bodyguards. Ezequiel, Osiel's brother, organized Los Escorpiones, the Scorpions. The Juarez cartel also acquired the extremely deadly group of sicarios known as La Línea, or the Line. But Cardenas wanted the best of the best. That's why in 1998, he hired Arturo Guzman de Sena, who became Z1. Guzman de Sena left his position as a lieutenant in the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Espaciales, GAEF for short, to head the personal security detail of the Gulf Cartel boss. The army paid little, and the earning potential in the Gulf Cartel was limitless. Along with Guzman de Sena, about 30 other military personnel eventually joined. They called themselves Los Zetas, or the Zs, after the Mexican military radio code for high-ranking officers. Everyone had a call sign with a number. Among them were De Sena's 2 main deputies, Rogelio González Pezaña, known as El Quelín, or Z2, and Heriberto Lascano, also known as El Lazca, the executioner, and Z3. Later, a small-time smuggler named Miguel Ángel Treviño Morales joined the group, followed by his brothers. They were not military men, but they were given call signs nonetheless, as their connections and love of violence proved very useful. Very soon, Los Zetas numbered 50 soldiers from the 7th Infantry Battalion and the 15th Motorized Cavalry Regiment, and formed Osiel Cardenas's Praetorian Guard. Later, they recruited Cabiles in Guatemala, elite soldiers of the Guatemalan army who had waged an extermination war against the country's indigenous population in the 1980s, and who were even more savage and ruthless in their methods of fighting those they called enemies. By 2003, Los Zetas had more than 300 elite fighters, who in turn opened recruitment camps for interested citizens. The era of amateur criminals and poorly trained police officers was over. Former members of GAEF, an elite army corps, were true masters of military affairs: intelligence, counterintelligence, and counterinsurgency, emergency response planning and execution, telecommunications, various techniques for eliminating enemies, interrogation tactics, and explosives manufacturing. They put all their knowledge and experience gained in America and Israel at the service of a domestic criminal organization. This was an important qualitative change. Many soldiers from different levels of the military hierarchy received bribes for protecting drug traffickers, but the possibility of desertion and joining the criminals was unthinkable before the creation of Los Zetas. Soldiers could be corrupt, but they could not betray even such a corrupt state. Guzman de Sena took this step from soldier to mercenary drug trafficker. Los Zetas took the war between drug organizations to an unprecedented level. Here are a couple of examples. In 1999, Osiel ordered Guzman de Sena to kill Rolando El Rolis Lopez Salinas. El Rolis was tracked down in his own home with his entire gang. De Sena and his men surrounded the building and, to get the job done quickly, blew up the house and everyone inside. In 2001, after his legendary escape from Puente Grande, El Chapo, along with Arturo Beltrán Leiva, believed that taking Nuevo Laredo would be easy. They sent people there to recruit locals. These Sinaloan agents were soon found dead at the doors of their safe houses. The bodies of the gang members were accompanied by a note, Chapo Guzman and Arturo Beltrán. Send us more idiots like these so we can kill them. According to the laws of organized crime, the strongest is the leader. There are no other levers of influence, and with the growing influence of the Gulf Cartel with its militant wing, Los Zetas, the rest had to follow suit. The creation and expansion of Los Zetas in the 90s and early 2000s was a real turning point in the history of organized crime in Mexico. A new type of organization emerged, whose material, technical, and military capabilities far exceeded those of any state or municipal police force. All that was needed to start a real war was a spark to set this power keg alight. Los Zetas began to help strengthen the Gulf Cartel in its original territories, from Chiapas to Tamaulipas, and expand it toward the central states of Michoacán and Guerrero. The Gulf Cartel's cells were named after the places where they were based: Los Metros in Matamoros, Los Rojos for those in Reynoso, Los Lobos for those in Nuevo Laredo, and so on. Today, the geographical significance of the names has been lost, but the names themselves are still widely used. The fact that it was the Zetas who led the expansion was an important organizational change. First, while continuing to serve as bodyguards for Osiel Cardenas, they began to take on the defensive and offensive functions of the entire cartel. In addition, the role of hitmen soon became too small for them, as they not only accompanied and protected but also organized businesses in the territory. The Zetas acquired operational capabilities not only for drug trafficking, but also for other crimes such as racketeering, extortion, kidnapping, and more. And this was the second innovation they introduced into the history of Mexican organized crime: the expansion of the drug traffickers' infrastructure to sell protection to local criminals and extract social rent. In other words, to obtain money from society. To make the model work, they appointed a Los Zetas boss in the captured territory, who became the king of all crime in the city and organized several military units that monitored the other criminal groups and kept them in check. In addition, they bought off the entire municipal police force so that they would not interfere in their operations, protected those who worked under the Los Zetas umbrella, and persecuted those who did not, as well as providing information about the operations of the Federal Judicial Police, or the Army. This was a completely new model of organized crime. They were not just drug traffickers, but racketeers, literally absolute rulers of the territory they had seized. The state was powerless in the territories controlled by the Gulf. As the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas expanded their presence over time, they built a huge criminal federation of almost national scope because through a network of leaders they left behind in dozens of cities in 16 Mexican states, they controlled hundreds of criminal gangs, a veritable criminal empire built on terror and violence. The new organization came to be known as Gulf Zetas, which was not the case with other organizations. Sinaloa did not become Sinaloa Los Negros, nor did Juarez become Juarez Los Pelones. How did this happen? Most likely, Osiel Cardenas, the leader of the Gulf Cartel, did not have the means or did not want to finance such a large military apparatus and allowed them to find their own sources of funding. The Zetas started out as hired workers, but as the Gulf Cartel became increasingly dependent on their force, they became partners. They were not leaders in drug trafficking, unable to move a ton of cocaine that would have brought them several $1 million in a single operation, but they extorted money from hundreds of criminal groups. In short, the history of organized crime owes a lot to the Los Zetas organization. First, they destroyed the hegemony of Sinaloa, which was unable to hold their territory during the division into plazas. Second, they expanded the drug trafficking corridor to the east and southeast of the country. Third, there was no family succession in this organization, and the resulting loyalty and ability to negotiate, which explains in short reign, Garcia Abrego ruled for 7 years and Osiel for 5 years, compared to almost 20 years for the Arellano Felix Carrillo Fuentes or Guzman Loera brothers. Fourth, the Gulf Zetas created professional military groups and effectively made violence the only way to resolve issues. And fifth, the Zetas transformed the model of a criminal organization by combining drug trafficking with complete control over all criminal enterprises in the territory they had seized. So, by the early 2000s, Osiel Cardenas had his own Los Zetas army. But due to his addiction to coke and insatiable greed, he did not fully understand who he was dealing with. Despite the fact that violence in Mexico was very intense in the last decade of the 20th century, Los Zetas proved to be much more unpredictable and savage than those who came before them. They were not deterred by family ties or political intrigue. The 21st century was dawning, and with it a new type of drug war. Los Zetas entered the period as the new trendsetters, but we'll talk about that in the next video.